Thank you very much, Henry. I'm Chris Cutler. I'm the Vice Chair of the CFA Society in New York, and I want to extend to all of you a very warm welcome. We're thrilled that you're here. And I was just speaking with a member of our staff, Rob Rowan, and we're really honored to have him here. And he was just sharing some insights that with regard to this space of this topic, everybody has a keen interest in it, but the way by which people analyze ESG, climate change, sustainable investing is still in flux. And there's a great deal of debate about methodologies. There's many, private sector firms that are sort of sharing their way to analyze it, but there's a lot of debate about it. And I cannot think of a better place to have that debate than here. I think that the role of local societies in our community, of the CFA community globally, is critical. We are an interface by which practitioners come together and figure out how best to conduct our practices. So I'm absolutely thrilled that all of you are here. And I really encourage you, if you're not members already, you are quite welcome to join us. What we look for criteria is if you're a CFA charter holder, you can join right away. If you're not a CFA charter holder, but you have equivalent work experience and you're of excellent repute, we'd love to have you as well. And, and we want this to be the community where people who share our values and our talents come together just like this. So I just have a few other comments that are sort of points of order. I would just ask if you have questions that we're honored to have our speakers here, and that's why we came to hear what the speakers have to say. So I would just ask that you keep your questions down to about half a minute. If you're talking longer than that with your question, it's probably best saved for the receptions. Most of the speakers will be here during the day, and we'll have other opportunities to speak with them. But let's let them, control the agenda of what they want to talk about. And I would just encourage all of you to get to know each other during the breaks. I want to hear from all of you. I'm really looking forward to meeting all of you. And with that, I would just like to introduce somebody who is a vigorous defender of CFA Institute's code of conduct, its values, and its level of and its standards in the industry. And I also say he's a vigorous debater. I've had a few debates with this gentleman myself, and I greatly respect him, and we're very honored to have him. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Paul Smith, who's the chair of the CFA Institute. Excuse me, the president of CFA Institute.
That means we argue a lot, I think. I'm not sure, but. Good morning, everybody. It's very nice to be here, and the first order of business, really, as Henry just said, is just to talk a little bit more about what Tom has accomplished here this morning. It really is not only the largest collection of asset owners we believe that the world has ever seen, but Tom's done that with very little budget and with virtually no resources. So it's been an amazing achievement. And because of the Asset Owner Series, we awarded Tom last year at the Institute our first inaugural Global Outstanding Young Leader Award, which he thoroughly deserved. Thank you. That's very kind of you. I was going to wait until the end of this for that. He does have a day job. He works for one of the rating agencies here in New York, and he tells me, and I have no reason to doubt it, that he's had, whilst he's been doing all of this, he's actually been able to achieve 3 promotions over the last 2 years as well. So I don't know quite what that's all about, but he's obviously doing extremely well. But more importantly, this is the 70th event that he has organized along with a lot of other volunteers here for CFA Society New York, which, as you can imagine, with well over 10,000 members in the world's financial capital, is the most important society that we have in our network of 151 societies around the world. So it's fabulous that he's done that, and you all here today, which is a sellout crowd, by the way. We've had people literally sort of ringing up day and night to try and get in this room. But Tom has organized events that have had over 13,000 attendees. So please put your hands together and thank Tom for everything that he's accomplished. What I wanted to do today is just to talk a little bit, to sort of throw out a few ideas, really. It's a keynote, it's not meant to be anything other than that. To throw out a few ideas about what we might like to think about and talk about during the day. And I guess a couple of quotes from the past, one from Milton Friedman in 1970. There is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. So that's Milton Friedman's view in 1970. Switch to Larry Fink, January 2018. Perhaps not everybody's first choice as someone who might fit very snugly into this room. But what did Larry say January of this year in his investor letter? To prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society. Companies must benefit all of their stakeholders, including shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities in which they operate. In 50 years, the tone at the top, very, very different. And I think for those of us perhaps who are looking at the challenge that the Paris Climate Accords face at the moment, it's encouraging, really, to think that in 50 years, our sense of what companies can be, what we're all trying to accomplish within the communities in which we serve, has changed so very much. And I think on that note, it's abundantly obvious that the Paris Climate Accord targets will not be met. I mean, I think that's something that needs to be said more. No matter what we do from here on in, it's very unlikely that those targets will be met. So, and without the US's participation, even doubly likely that that's the case. So it is incumbent upon each and every one of us in this room, it is incumbent upon the actions of private citizens, pension plans, asset owners, etc., to try to do whatever we can to make sure that the planet is safeguarded. I was interested that the Asset Owners Disclosure Project came out recently to say that 60% of the world's largest pension funds provide very or little to no information on financial implications of climate change on their portfolios. 60%. So there's a lot of work to do as far as that's concerned. Today you'll find a number of reports that the CFA has accomplished over the last few years. We have a 2017 survey on ESG, what our members feel about ESG. More importantly, just published is a work that we've done with UNPRI, talking about how, or exploring the way that companies around the world are integrating PRI into their investment decision-making process, ESG into their investment decision-making process. That's printed and out and available for you. It's also on our website. More importantly, it has a variety of case studies from around the world. I think about 31 of those really excellent case studies of how companies are actually doing this in practice. And it goes without saying that most of that is happening through the equity portfolios at the moment rather than the fixed income portfolios. And most of the activity is driven through client demand rather than through the values and beliefs, as it were, of the businesses themselves. And I think as the asset management industry, particularly in the US and Canada, thank you so much, particularly in the US and Canada, would accept. The challenge here is obviously that incorporating ESG values can have difficulties for companies given their fiduciary responsibilities towards their clients. So one of the challenges that I think is out there today is the balance between regulation and action, really. And I think that's one thought that I hope we explore today is how do we encourage governments around the world to intelligently regulate, to help asset management companies fulfill some of their duties, not just to their clients, but towards the communities in which they live. I think there's a world of complexity in that statement that we need to think a little bit more about. Matt Orsig from the CFA Institute, who's been involved in that report, will talk to us later. Obviously, we have challenges in terms of how ESG actually works. But my thought is, are we spending far too much time arguing about data and definition around ESG and far too little time actually doing something about it. It strikes me that our industry is mired in this definitional taxonomy conversation rather than actually stepping up to the plate and doing something. So these conversations really, in many ways, I think, are an excuse for inactivity. And so I think we need to talk less about definition and slightly more about execution, about moving our industry towards where we want it to be. This is the snapshot from that 2017 report I told you about, some of the highlights from it. The one thing that always jumps off the page to me in this is really, as I say, that the reason why most companies most asset managers anyway, incorporate ESG into their portfolios is no more than client demand. So client demand is still an absolute key focus. So some of the other points coming out of this, over 50% of asset managers now incorporate ESG. Governance is still the largest part of the E, the S, and the G, and I'll come back to that in a second. But over the last 2 years, we did this survey in 2015, again in 2017. You can see that all three of those categories are ticking up slightly, although not dramatically, it has to be said. I think this is another thought that I've been having recently. Governance, I think, is used, and perhaps that Asset Owners Disclosure Project report sort of poked at that. Governance is often used, I think, by a lot of asset managers, perhaps by a lot of asset owners, to sort of claim compliance with ESG as a goal, as a drift in the world. I think it's probably time now, and I know this isn't everybody's view, to sort of separate the E, the S, and the G out. I know of very, very few asset managers around the world who aren't focused on governance. I mean, I live in Hong Kong, for instance, and anyone who's managing money in Asia who isn't focused on governance is really not doing their job very well, and I think that's generally accepted. Not because of sustainability issues, but because it's clearly a vital factor in any investment thesis. And I wonder whether sustainable investing, and by that I mean investing that takes care of the environment as well as social policy and social impact, I wonder if sustainable investing is getting lost in the shuffle, really, between the E, the S, and the G. And I think it's time, perhaps, that we separated that label out a little bit, that it's now no longer doing us the favors that it has in the past. This goes back to what I was trying to say earlier, that client demand is by far the biggest piece of the drive behind ESG. But I think another comment that I would have there, proven link between ESG and financial performance is very important to investors. And I question that as well, really. Our industry, and very much what we teach at CFA Institute, is a backward-looking industry. It works off data, historical data, despite the fact that we all put on our product sheets, for instance, the disclaimer that the past is no guide to the future. There isn't a charter holder out there, there isn't a financial analyst out there who doesn't spend all of their time, she or he, looking backwards at data to project the future. And that isn't going to help us in this area, because the data just isn't there today, and likely isn't going to be there for a number of years. This is long-term, this is innovative, this is creative, this is forward-thinking. And our industry today is geared towards a backward-looking, data-driven industry. So I challenge us all to think a little bit more carefully than that. Equities, as I said earlier, by far the overwhelming asset class that people look at. I want to skip just through those. This, I think, is interesting. Something of a generational divide between the way that young people, the millennial generation, look at ESG and the way that people of my vintage look at ESG. And also, equally importantly, when you consider that well over 50% of the world's assets are going to be in the hands of women going forward. Remember, for the gentlemen in the audience, that our spouses outlive us by a number of years, and assets are migrating from the hands of men into the hands of women. Women care much more about ESG issues, particularly about environmental and social issues, than men do. And I think that's a very hopeful and positive sign for the future. So we are publishing in the next month something called the Investment Firm of the Future. It's a great piece of research, and I would encourage you all to try to find it on our website if at all possible. And what it's trying to say is to look at what the firm of the future might look like in 10 years' time. What will the investment company of the future look like in 10 years' time? And it's research based, obviously, on conversations with asset managers and with portfolio managers around the world. And these are the three main sort of takeaways. Firstly, that ESG models are still far too much to one side of the investment analysis process and not fully integrated. Secondly, despite what companies say, stewardship is still a tiny fraction of most asset management companies' expenses. Today, impacts of portfolio positioning are not really embedded within that process. Stewardship is less than 5% of most asset management companies' budgets. Now, I know groups like Hermes in London and indeed BlackRock, to go back to them, have announced an increase in their focus on stewardship, but it's still a tiny percentage of what asset managers focus on. Universal owners work together, beginning to work together. We feel that that is something that is coming, that in 10 years' time you'll see a great deal more collaboration between the people in this room than we've had at the moment. And all asset owners, hopefully, will report on the impacts of their portfolios relative to SDG going forward. Part of this report also was to poke at what will clients expect from us in the future. And I think going back to what I was saying about the millennial generation and about women in particular, I think some of these trends are coming out of that. We expect an increasing demand for products that incorporate personal values. 72% expect that their firm's future commitment to research of ESG issues will be higher than it is today. And remember that technology is enabling pension plan participants to engage much more directly in the way that their assets are managed going forward. So a lot more engagement from our clients and a lot more sense that the companies of the future that are going to be successful not only are going to marry technology and values, but values themselves are going to be so much more important to that successful business. And we believe that that's the direction that the asset management industry is going through, that it's going to be, through technology, enabled to be much more responsive to the way that individual people feel their money should be run. And as those clients change, that is going to be an enormous tailwind for this subject that we're talking about today. So I think all of that is very positive. I know it's a challenge at times to think positively, but that's where we see it. And this is the sort of the checklists that I think that we feel investment companies are going to have to live by if they're going to be successful going forward. In terms of detail, we've been moving the curriculum in this direction for a long time now. Never enough. Our critics are always saying that we don't have enough about ESG in the curriculum. It's a charge that I suspect that we're guilty of, but we can only go as fast as the industry is going. And if you think about our curriculum, it's really your curriculum. Our job in life is to produce a curriculum that prepares young people for their role as an asset owner or as an asset manager. And so the more that the people in this room take ownership of the curriculum, the better we will reflect what you think we should be teaching. And we do that through a process called practice analysis that we do every year. It's a rolling process where we go out into the industry and we ask CEOs and CIOs what they want in the curriculum. So if this curriculum isn't reflecting where you believe practice is, then we need to know about that. But we believe we do a pretty good job of that. So if there isn't enough in ESG in the curriculum, then to some extent, you need to take ownership of that challenge and work with us to try and reflect that better back to you. The other challenge we have is similar to the ones that, that asset owners have, that our curriculum reflects current practice rather than thinks about what the world might look like in 10 years' time. We're not trying to be on the bleeding edge of anything. We're trying to reflect what the industry, where the industry stands today. And I think that's as much of a challenge for us as it is for asset owners and asset managers. How much should we be out in front of where the industry is today? And I'm very, very happy if we can talk about that at some point during the day in the coffee breaks or whatever, where you feel the Institute should be in terms of its leadership role in this area. We try and do that, obviously, through a lot of the thought leadership, and a lot of that is in the room today, as I said. We try and do that through working with people like CFA Society in New York on events like the one that we have today. But we don't reflect that leadership position within the curriculum today. We reflect what the industry is currently situated at. Some of the things that we do, obviously, is we talk about improved financial statement presentation a lot. We are actively involved with the Integrated Reporting Council, with FASB, with all of the international accounting standards boards, trying to work towards a better financial presentation of ESG factors. And we're also thinking about how, and again, I'd love your views on this, how we can move GIPS, perhaps Global Investment Performance Standards, in the direction of ESG reporting as well. That's a thought that we've been having a lot. How can we use some of the standard setting capability that the Institute has to move things forward? So what does the future hold? Asset owners and investors have a responsibility to engage. ESG considerations will certainly rise, growing social consciousness, changing in the indexation world, and impact investing will also rise. And one other thought that I didn't put on this slide is that change is coming from quarters that perhaps people in this country are not familiar with. If you think about MiFID II, for instance, and the impact that that has had upon US asset managers, ESG is going to be similar, in my view. The EU is in the process of consulting about some very wide-ranging regulation at the moment around accounting disclosures, around ESG issues. And China, too, has a massive role to play here. For anyone who's spent any time in China, you'll know that green bond finance is something that the Chinese lead the world in. When they think about the Belt Road Initiative that is so key to Chinese economic development, it's all around how that can be sustainably financed. And I think one of the things I love to say when I'm in this country is that it's no longer possible for American asset management companies who wish to play in the international arena to ignore the rules and regulations that are being set by the Europeans and the Chinese. And I think over the next 20 or 30 years, you'll find that increasingly to be the case, that EU and Chinese regulation, in the same way that MiFID II has been a bit of a wake-up call for a lot of US asset managers, will consistently impinge and infringe on the way that American asset managers have to conduct their business going forward. So I think that's another important thought that we can hopefully explore during the day. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much for listening to me.